My name is Karima Bennoune. I'm a professor of international law at Rutgers University, the law school in Newark, and I am half Algerian and half American.
Okay. That sums up all the vital statistics. Is that good?
I think so.
Okay. All right. So, as you know, this program, or what we are doing, is collecting a variety of key ideas and thoughts on best practices for reducing violence against women in particular. And a topic certainly you know one or two things about. Tell me a little bit, start out by discussing some of the challenges posed to universal human rights in general by fundamentalism.
Well, I think there are many of them. I mean, I think one of the first sort of assaults on women's human rights from fundamentalism is the basic challenge to the universality of human rights, to that very notion. Fundamentalists of all faiths tend to focus on a very immutable idea of culture and religion and tradition that they have kind of written in their own image. And that then really serves to limit women's choices, to put women in boxes. And they very often use women's identity, women's sexuality as sort of key political issues. And so I think in those ways they really serve to undercut the ideas of women's human rights. Then there are much more overt examples, of course, of the attacks by fundamentalists on women's human rights, whether it is direct attacks on women's human rights defenders. Sometimes those are legal attacks, as we heard the example this morning in Malaysia. Sometimes those are very open physical attacks, such as I know that many of my friends in Algeria witnessed and were threatened with. Sometimes you see fundamentalist attacks on women based on how they dress, if they're assumed not to be dressed in a fashion that is proper enough. So in Algeria, for example, in the 1990s, the fundamentalist armed groups would go out and kill young girls standing at the bus stop on their way to school who did not have their heads covered. And Algeria is not the only place, certainly, where this happens. Sometimes we see fundamentalist attacks on women professionals, women going out to work. You then also, ironically, see fundamentalist attacks sometimes on women in what are actually traditional roles, such as sort of fortune tellers and beauticians, and attacks on women in those capacities as well. So I think all the way from the theoretical undermining of women's human rights through an ideology that questions women's right to even be sort of in the human category rather than in the kind of specific cultural box, all the way across to the most literal physical assaults on women. And I have to stress, I mostly am talking here about things that have happened with regard to Muslim fundamentalists, because a lot of my work has concerned that. But certainly we see this in Christian fundamentalism, in Jewish fundamentalism, in Hindu fundamentalism, and beyond. Alas, just like the universality of human rights, the universality of the problem of religious extremism and the problem of the fundamentalist focus on and targeting of women is truly universal. And although that said, I mean, it does sometimes take very specific forms in different contexts.
Yeah, and specifically I'm thinking some of the things here: forced marriage, marital rape, gender discrimination, some of those particular things. What challenges and, I guess, effective ways to combat those challenges?
I mean, effective ways to combat fundamentalism, I think that's a very tough question, and a question that maybe needs to be answered. Sort of the best answer would be a context-specific answer, but I can think about some general ideas. One, I think, is education. I think education is an absolutely vital way of challenging religious absolutism, education of both women and men, education in the sort of secular sense in terms of education that allows people to participate in the workforce and to have opportunity, also rights education so that people are aware where women are aware of their human rights. Also, sort of sensible and informed and rational religious education so that fundamentalists are not able to mislead people about the content of religion and to make people believe that their fundamentalist interpretation is the only interpretation. So, for example, fundamentalists are, very zealous in many contexts about women covering up. And I can tell you in the Muslim context, I think they often misrepresent garments like the hijab and suggest that somehow these are religiously mandated. In fact, nothing in the Quran says that women have to cover their heads. There's sort of language about unseen parts. It's much more general than that. And certainly there is no specific mandate to wear specific kinds of garments like the hijab, all the way up to the horrendous burqa, for example. But if people are not actually educated and do not necessarily even have a full awareness of the teachings of their own religion and the range of teachings and interpretations, they may be in a very difficult situation to combat those kinds of arguments. So I guess if I had to pick one key strategy for combating fundamentalism, it certainly would be education.
So again, your take on this thing called Islamic feminism, your thoughts on it, how do you define it?
Well, I guess the first thing I would say is I think one of the things that we have to respect is that there are indeed many different kinds of feminism and many different kinds of women's human rights advocacy. And I think we need to respect those many forms. And I think often the fact that different parts of the women's human rights movement globally use different strategies can be a strength. And in fact can be a way of bringing in women across all sorts of different categories and life experiences. My understanding of Islamic feminism is that it is really an attempt to reinterpret many of the sort of teachings of Islam and fundamental texts of the Muslim religion in a way that is friendly to women's human rights, or perhaps I should say more friendly to women's human rights than some of the other traditional conservative or fundamentalist interpretations of those things. And from that perspective, I think it is a very important project for Muslim women who are religious and also proponents of women's human rights to have a space where those things can coexist. That said, I would say that for me personally, I work in a universal human rights framework as a woman of Muslim heritage who is also secular. And for me, the universal human rights framework is the most important framework in my work toward advancing the human rights of women globally, including Muslim women and women of Muslim heritage. I think there are limitations to both approaches. But I would also say that I am particularly concerned with what seems to be a sort of a vogue right now, including on the left in progressive circles, that sort of suggests that somehow there's a kind of Islamic exceptionalism, that Muslims are different than other people. And sometimes, this is meant in a positive sense. It isn't necessarily meant pejoratively, that they have a different culture from other people, and therefore universal human rights should not apply to them in the same way. So I guess the most important thing that I want to say is I recognize and welcome the contributions of Islamic feminism, just as I recognize and welcome the contributions made by other forms of women's human rights struggle in Muslim contexts. My only concern is the idea that one of those paradigms, particularly the Islamic feminism paradigm, would be said to be sort of the only appropriate paradigm. And I think even the fact now that we talk about, more than 1 billion people in the world as simply Muslims, as if they didn't also have other identities. There are people who have nationalities, ethnicities. Perhaps they come from a particular sect within Islam. They might be Shi'ites, they might be Sunni, they might be Ismailis, they might be Ahmadis, and so on and so forth. As people who have sexual orientation, as people who have class identities, political identities. They may be from the right, from the left, from the center. And we sort of collapse all of that complexity, out of the picture by writing people simply as being Muslims to whom only Islamic law applies, which is not the position, I would say, of most Islamic feminists. But I think sometimes when other people pick up their paradigm and run with it, it can sort sort of lead in that direction. And that's where I think it's very important also to maintain the perspective of universal human rights and the notion that universal human rights apply to all people. And what I find very interesting is that many women's human rights defenders in various Muslim contexts are using universal human rights law to make their arguments. Now, to sort of trendy multiculturalists in Western countries, that may seem kind of less quote-unquote authentic, but human rights belongs to everyone. So when we see, for example, Sudanese women's rights activists protesting the sentencing of a Sudanese woman journalist to flogging for the crime of wearing trousers in a restaurant, what we see is that they are making international human rights law arguments. There was a wonderful petition that they circulated globally about 2 years ago now, and their arguments were couched in the African Protocol on Women's Rights and international human rights law, not in an Islamic law framework. The same thing is true if you look at some of the human rights advocates, for example, who opposed the Pakistani government's concession to rule by Sharia in the Swat Valley back in 2009, prior to the military's move into the area. And many of those Pakistani human rights advocates like Iqbal Haider and others used the universal language of democracy and human rights to criticize that move. Meanwhile, here in U.S. universities, you were hearing academics sort of say, oh, this is a sort of a nod to tradition by the Pakistani authorities. In fact, on the ground, in the, at that time, most recent elections, the local electorate had utterly rejected the fundamentalist parties. So in fact, this was not a move that was accepted. So we see a number of these human rights advocates in Muslim contexts using the language of universal human rights, and we have to be very careful not to take that tool out of their toolbox by shifting away from or moving away from human rights when we talk about people we call Muslims and people who may call themselves Muslims.
This is the 10th anniversary of WLP. I wonder if you can offer some thoughts or perspective of the value and the benefit of their work, in terms of dealing with local advocacy groups, in pulling together the whole issue of universal human rights.
I really salute the work of WLP, and I remember also collaborating with WLP back when it was called the Sisterhood is Global Institute, and back in the 1990s. And one of the things that I think is so important is the connections that WLP helps to foster among women's human rights defenders who are working in different contexts. And I think what is critical now is sort of unity and linkages in the international women's human rights movement, because while we each face particularities in the different contexts that we are working in, we face many of the same kinds of challenges. And I think the role of WLP in bringing people together, like this incredible gathering today, and to really share best practices, to share frustrations, to share strategies and learn from each other's strategies is simply tremendous. And I particularly salute the work of Mahnaz Afkami, who I know has worked on all of these issues for decades. And I worked with her at the time of the Beijing Fourth World Conference on Women's Rights with the wonderful book that she edited, Faith and Freedom, Women's Human Rights in the Muslim World, and the panel that she organized in Beijing at the NGO Forum around those issues. And I know from the time that I've been doing this work how exhausting it is, and she keeps going with this creativity and vision. And so I salute her and her colleagues for their important work. Being here today has been very meaningful to me, because I think what's hard in this work is when you feel alone and when you feel isolated. And at the moment in the U.S. context, where we're experiencing both serious, severe, pervasive discrimination against Muslims on the one hand from the broader U.S. population, and then at the same time we're still contending with the problem globally and in our own population of Muslims here of fundamentalism. One feels a sort of a shrinking space in which to really engage in a multi-directional critical discourse, and I think that is something that the Women's Learning Partnership has really helped to preserve. So I really thank them for that work, and long may it continue. Although let us hope that the need for it will diminish.
You spoke a lot about the importance of making connections in terms of being able to advance the movement. I wonder if you'd share with us a little bit. It occurs to me that a personal anecdote is the story about the scarf that you're wearing today. Tell me about it.
I will have to get somebody's permission before you can use the story, if that's okay.
If you don't,
you know what, I would, but you know what,
Okay.
Can I do it without the names?
Sure.
Okay. So I will tell the personal anecdote of this scarf. This beautiful scarf was given by one wonderful women's human rights activist friend of mine to another who recently passed away. And when after this other woman who was a real pioneer in the women's human rights movement, Rhonda Copeland, when she passed away, I was helping to clean out her apartment. And some of the other women who were there knew that we were all sort of connected in this link and chain of friendship that was built through women's rights advocacy, and they very kindly gave me this scarf. And now when I'm going out into the world and talking about women's human rights issues, especially in contexts where I know it's going to be very challenging, I'm going to wear this scarf because I really feel then I carry the courage and the power and the vision of those two women with me. And I feel like maybe that's what WLP is about, bringing us together to empower us. And so in some ways, I think my scarf is a symbol, perhaps, a very small symbol of what this project is all about.